Chapter 12. For half a dozen years, Cash Conklin had constituted the final law in his sinister mesquite brush domain. He ran true to form in this moment of breaking violence. Pat saw him whip up the sawed-off greener, and with one smooth flowing movement, Stevens drew his .45, firing under Chad Hanlon's arm, and the gun slammed hollowly. The slug smashed the lock of the shotgun, tearing the weapon out of Conklin's hands. Mirror and glass shattered as the back of the bar was jingling with glasses. A flying fragment slashed Cash's fleshy cheek, and with a bellow of surprise and rage he plunged down behind the bar. Stack was dancing around excitedly a yard or two away, trying to get a clear shot at Pat. He had fired wide the first time, but now he was waiting his chance. His gun hovered, glinting, ready to slash down, and there was murder in his eyes. "Drop Hanlon!" he bawled furiously. "Get out of the way, would ya?" But Chad was helpless. Pat still held him rigid, binding the man inescapable between himself and Stack's threatening six-gun. It was all that saved him from being riddled in a twinkling. Hanlon's unfortunate position baffled his jackal, forcing him to hold his fire this one critical fragment of time. Pressed against Chad's side, Pat's unwavering gun barrel swung round barely in time to meet the menace. He crashed out heavily, and unhit, Stack dodged aside with a snarl of fury. But he wasn't done yet, and suddenly he rushed, mouth gaping crooked in a harsh yell. Pat felt the shock as Pat slammed against Hanlon on the other side, and he saw the upraised gun. The ruffian meant to bludgeon him, slashing past Hanlon's head as a man swinging an axe. Pat's Colt muzzle tilted, another smashing reverberation, and the slug tore across Stack's shoulder, and the blast burned in his face. He staggered back and crashed to the floor and began to crawl away. He'd had enough. Pat's keen ear had picked up a thud in the boots from the back room seconds ago. From the first moment, he'd been wary of the men that were playing cards in there, under no illusion as to their deadly caliber. They proved far from anxious to get into the fight, however. Perhaps they suspected the presence of law, for not one of them put in an appearance. Stevens heard them pounding out the back, and lost all further track of them as the struggling man in his fierce clutch found means to give him trouble. Desperation led Chad Hanlon power beyond his normal strength, and jabbing an elbow against Pat's chest, he forced him back. Pat's gun barrel, raising swiftly, struck at his twisting face, and it gashed Hanlon's jaw. On the instant, Hanlon's foot descended crushing on Pat's instep, and simultaneously some heavy object landed across his shoulders from behind with terrific force. It was Cash Conklin, wielding the broken greener as he would a club. Even as he went down, thrown off balance, and thrusting out an arm to save himself, Pat fired sideways through the lower portion of the bar. It was a random try, but it told. Struck in the leg, Conklin sank beneath the bar once more with a groan, out of this fight for some time. Hanlon had succeeded in breaking Pat's hampering grip at last, and he stumbled away as the other fell, his boots hammering the plank boards as he raced towards the back. Catching himself on his knees, Pat whirled, oblivious to the numbing pain, his raising gun sweeping the shadowy interior, too late for use. Like Hanlon, Stack had made good his escape. Except for Cash Conklin groaning behind the bar, Pat had the place to himself. Within 3 minutes after the first crash of a gun, silence returned to the room, layered with smoke. Pat rose unsteadily, trying to experiment the foot on which Chad had stamped, and limbered out gently. It was all right. Methodically then, he plunged out the empty shells in his gun, recharged the chambers. A couple of strides took him to the end of the bar. A glance satisfied him that the moaning Conklin was no longer constituting a menace. Broken chairs and overturned tables littered the room, where they had been scattered about. The card room, conspicuously vacant now, was in a similar condition, cards and chips scattered about the floor. Pat passed through that wide arch leading into the store half of the establishment. It was empty, except for flies buzzing with melancholy persistence amid the merchandise. He was stepping out the front door, steely challenge in his leisurely manner, when the quick thud of hoofs came to his ears. A man came racing down the road, hell-bent over the settle, and who had seemed warning about what was afoot. Pat got a flash of the rugged, flat face as he thundered past, and they fired together, a ball slamming into the wall over Pat's shoulder. On the instant, the renegade reeled back. His ear disappeared from the side of his head as if sliced off, and blood gushed out his jaw. And with a yell, he mastered his horse and swung away, jabbing the spurs in deep. Pat gazed after him, too surprised to fire again. "Well," he exclaimed, "where'd you spring from?" All too plainly he had recognized the other man, and one more tumbler dropped into place to reinforce his understanding of the tangled skeins of events since he had ridden away from Powder Valley. More than one of the ponies which had been standing before Conklin's grocery on his arrival seemed to have mysteriously disappeared, carrying the rats from this unsavory warren with full flight. But Jigger still waited alertly. Swinging astride, Pat swept the dingy brush with a hard scrutiny and then turned away. Half an hour later, he was plodding up the sandy wash leading into the hills, and he swung right at the fork. Nebraska Swingle's sprawling block-S ranch house, a low-roofed adobe fortress of a place, stood on the edge of a pine-sprinkled flat crowded against the rearing hills. The ranch road curved round the trees and entered a beaten yard thick with yellow dust. Of late years, it was Nebraska's custom to spend the larger portion of his time in a rawhide chair tilted against the thick adobe wall in the shade of a gnarly pine tree, jaws oscillating ruminantly in his beady, ice-colored eyes, roving shrewdly over everything in sight. There, Pat found the Indian-faced old warrior today. Rugged and thick-bodied, far from looking his 60-odd years, the cattleman lifted his sharp gaze to the younger man's face, and his flat, silvery-stubbed jaws stopped working. He gave not an unfriendly nod, but made no other move, nor did he speak. Pat drew Jigger to a stand, and eased his seat in the saddle, glancing about lazily. "Howdy," he said. "I reckon you're Swingle?" Nebraska rumbled an agreement. Pat introduced himself. "You probably know all about me. I've met one or two of your boys," he informed the other. Swingle's unwavering eye measured him without haste. "Yep," he allowed cagily. "I got you placed. Are you making a job of the anvil, Stevens?" he demanded pointedly. Pat nodded. "It'll be a ranch," he promised, and then told Swingle about the lazy mare in Powder Valley. "As I see it, the two outfits will balance each other quite nicely. I'll make you a bid for the Block S one of these days," he grinned. Nebraska shook his head to some thought of his own. Regret briefly shadowed his leathery face. "Well, you're young," he mused aloud gruffly. "It's your chance to put in an operation, an old scheme of my own. The range was just too wild in my day." He gathered himself then. "What do you want with me, Stevens? Money? Steers?" Pat smiled his denial. "Maybe that's a compliment, Swingle, but I'm prepared to buy your cattle if you will sell." The old cattleman was thoughtful. "Thought of coming to me first, did you?" "Well, as a matter of fact, I didn't," Pat said frankly. He told of the threatening trouble with McLennan, H.M., and his efforts to try and nullify it. Swingle heard his account of the interview with Henry McLennan without comment. Evidently he knew something of the situation on the northern range, as well as the San Pedro country. "Stevens, what did Hanlon have against Ace Kangle?" he demanded suddenly. Pat arrested, searching the broad, inscrutable face. He was unprepared for the abrupt change of subject. Well, I've asked myself that, he said with a pause. Nebraska chuckled internally. Ain't no throwing you off balance, is there? He remarked with candor. Well, what's your grudge agin Chad, then? And don't forget, I may know more'n you think, he added flatly. Pat found himself telling this man how the deed to the anvil had disappeared a few hours after its purchase. Nor did he hold back a number of details concerning the events in town hitherto known only to himself. Instinct told him Nebraska could be a trusted man. Swingle scratched his jaw as he listened and looked away. That his thoughts were busy, he proved a moment later. Dane Hardwick's a friend of mine, he announced quietly. Reckon I'll have a talk with him. Now, these two salty old bucks you brought here with you, Stevens, just who are they? Pat's gravity cracked in a grin. He identified Ezra and Sam briefly, describing the jam that Chip Connor had accidentally placed them in, and the cattlemen followed all this attentively. Old friends of yours, eh? He appeared to ponder. What brand was on them horses? Pat started to tell him. Swingle waved a gnarled hand before he was done. Ah, sure, I know that stock. Good stuff. I know who owns it, too. He thought for a moment. Nothing to worry there, my man. Go on back to your place, Stevens, and just let me think a spell. Much obliged, Swingle. Pat was serene. I took your measure almost as fast as you took mine, and I wasn't wrong. He straightened up in the saddle, lifting the rein. How many steers are you taking? Nebraska barked out abruptly as Pat turned away. I figure anywhere up to 300 or 400 head, Pat told him. More later if the range will carry it. They talked price, age, quality with the brevity of stockmen who knew what they were about. Swingle nodded curtly at the end. Rest easy. We'll deliver in a few days and drop over again, why don't you, Stevens? Pat thanked him again and jogged out of the yard. He was grinning as he struck off across the hills towards the anvil. Well, Sam and Ezra have been worrying themselves skinny about them horses, he thought. Maybe they'll learn something that it pays to know the right people. Me, for instance. He could not doubt that Nebraska Swingle would be as good as his word. The cattleman had power in the San Pedro. He had mentioned Sheriff Hardwick, and doubtless was well known to Ben Haskin of Bisbee as well. Pat had been canvassing that luckless horse deal in his thoughts for some time, knowing he might have to take action finally. Now he put the matter out of his mind. Block S cattle dotted the range plentifully. Knowing he would soon own some of these steers, Pat looked them over with approval as he rode. Once he paused to drag out a calf of a rocky gully where the mother cow was bawling. He was busy removing his rope from the calf's heels and crouched briefly on one knee out of reach of the angry cow's horns when a level, rasping voice broke in his ears. Drop that running iron. He whirled with lightning swiftness to halt as suddenly at sight of Chip Connor grinning down on him from his horse a dozen feet away. Pat had caught no inkling of his approach, and the circumstances struck him as singular. Cat-footing around, are you? He said easily. You haven't been trailing me for a while by any chance? I've been following you ever since you went to the H.M., Stevens, the puncher admitted cheerfully as Pat remounted and they rode on together. Never did get close enough to hear what you was saying to Hank McLennan, though. Had to kind of circle around El Castro, too, and I sure would have got into the play there at Casbella if you had given me time. You didn't seem to have any trouble, though, taking care of yourself, he added approvingly. Pat waited till he was done. So you think somebody might be on my back trail, Chip? He queried curiously. Connor shrugged. He was not inclined to discuss it, but it was obvious that he thought so, and as a consequence had followed what he considered to be a practical course. I won't say you were any slouch at holding your own, Pat went on with a dry smile. You handed it to Marion McLennan till I wondered what got into you. Chip promptly displayed indifference. I reckon I kind of lost my head a moment there, he managed gruffly. I'm not so sure of that. Pat studied him with some interest. There seems to me to be a lot of savvy in what you said to her, and if I'm not mistaken, I think she thought so as well. Connor continued to look away, his tone strangely subdued. It wasn't really, though, my place to say those things, Stevens. I didn't do you any good either. Pat refused to look at the matter in just that light, however. You think she can't take it, eh? Because she doesn't have it? Chip whirled in a quick protest to that. No, I don't mean that at all. She ain't like what you think she is, Stevens, he exclaimed warmly. And how do you think she is? Pat countered. Connor waved an impatient hand. I know she acts rich and arrogant, but that's just her way. It doesn't mean anything, and I should have remembered that. Actually, he slowed to halt utterance. Well, Marion really is in a jackpot, and she's scared to death. Oh, yeah? Pat's challenge sounded just skeptical enough to prod the other on. Don't get her wrong, Chip urged strongly. She manages the HM for that fat uncle, but she doesn't hold $1's interest in the place. Figure it for yourself, Stevens. Things are going wrong over there, and Chad Hannon's bound her to marry him. And not only that, McLennan's been after her to yoke up with some mining man from Bonanza Belt. It seems that the family connection will bolster his own bank account. Is that enough to rowel a girl like her into showing some spunk? Pat was scrutinizing this fresh picture of Marion McLennan's prospects with close attention. And just what, he wondered audibly, what would she want with the anvil? She's certainly taken plenty of punishment trying to get it. Hell, that's as plain as daylight, exclaimed Chip. Why would any ambitious person like her want the anvil? Heck, why do you want it? It's a fine ranch that spells independence and living on her own. Connor unconsciously warmed him to the subject. Well, Pat, she's got it all figured out. She'd run a few head of cattle, of course, but mainly she wants to raise horses for the mines. It's a steady market, and she could sell 'em timber off the place, too, for shoring and such. She'd get on fine, trust her for that. He stopped suddenly in some confusion and stole a look at Pat. The latter was gazing off across the range in a brown study. It was some time before he spoke. You seem to be pretty well posted on her plans, Chip, he observed at last. Well, I have talked to her about it casually, the puncher was reluctant to continue. Pat faced him square. I'm not questioning your knowledge. Are you in love with her, Chip? He asked bluntly. Connor's color deepened, but he didn't evade the issue. I reckon I am, he confessed. But that don't mean anything. I never told her I was, and now I'm pretty sure I'll never have the chance. Shucks, Stevens, I'm nothing but a darn cowpoker. And my foreman, Pat reminded him quietly. Thanks, but a foreman ain't big enough to impress her, least of all a mouthy one like I turned out to be. Pat laughed. I didn't notice that she went off the handle to you in the same way she did with me, at any rate. In fact, I thought you eared her down pretty handy, Connor. Chip's face was a dusky red now. He declined to take any part of this brand of levity where Marion was concerned. It's no laughing matter, he insisted. I told you where she stands, and you've been mighty white to me, Stevens. I ain't forgetting that, but if you let her down, you're letting me down as well. I ain't expecting a thing from her personally, but if there's any way I can see to it that she gets a fair shake, I'll do it." "Oh, don't let yourself get into a lather," Pat told him, suppressing a grin at the other's earnestness. "As for that girl, I haven't thrown her down yet, and I'm not much on making promises. All I can say is that I'll see what I can figure out." Chip had to let it go at that. End of chapter 12.